Good morning, or actually good afternoon. This is Mark Hendrickson, one of the executive directors of Florida ALHFA, welcoming you to the second session of the 2020 Florida ALHFA Annual Educational Conference, Congress and the Florida Legislature. Really happy that everyone was able to join today. There's a few logistical things that we want to take care of. Lisa, if you could just do your slide and then kick it back to me.
Absolutely, thank you. This is Lisa Jawhead. I am your technical assistant for today's webinar. Please note that all participants are muted upon entry. We do want you to participate with your questions. Please locate the question box in your dashboard off to the right. There should be a box that says questions. If you click on that arrow, it should expand so that we can see your questions. If you have trouble with your audio, please log out and log back in. You can also send a message directly to me or call in using your phone. And we have the audio call-in number there. If you have any other questions, you can email me during the presentation at Jawhead, which is DJAHED @flhousing.org. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the Florida Housing Coalition, who's doing the behind-the-scenes work for our conference in running all of our webinars and Zoom meetings that will be taking place over the next month. Before we begin on the substantive part, we want to thank our sponsors. If you go to our platinum level sponsors, Lisa. Thank you to our 10 platinum level sponsors: Hillsborough HFA, Jacksonville HFA, Panelists HFA, Broward HFA, HFA of Miami-Dade County, HFA of Lee County, and the Escambia HFA, along with Raymond James, eHousing Plus, and RBC Capital Markets. Special thanks to all of those. And if you could go to the gold. I'm not going to read all of these out, but thanks to all of these gold sponsors for hanging in with us through this. I want to put out a reminder that both this entire session will be available if someone misses it, and you can access that through the Florida ALHFA website, FLALHFA.com, and also this PowerPoint, which is very long today, and we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on many of the slides. That PowerPoint will also be available on the website. Thanks to the gold sponsors. If you could move on to our silver sponsors, give them some screen time, and our bronze and breakfast sponsor. And again, noting that a breakfast sponsor is somewhere above silver and below gold. Thank you, First Housing. If you could again go to the panelists. Thank you. Again, I'm Mark Hendrickson. Our panelists today are Ken Pruitt, the president of the P5 group, who leads our lobbying effort in the Florida Legislature. Sarah Bascom, the president of Bascom Communications, who leads our communication effort. And Jonathan Payne, the executive director of NALFA, who will be leads our federal legislative effort and will be updating us. And the panelists will be speaking in that order. If you could flip to the next slide, the one after the picture. Thank you. As many of you know, the fiscal year for the state begins tomorrow, so the governor was required to sign the budget and/or veto whatever he was going to veto by today. And so yesterday, the governor signed the budget along with about $1 billion of vetoes that he included. Among those vetoes that he issued were $225 million of the SHIP appropriation. He also announced last week that he was allocating $250 million of federal CARES Act money for housing, with 120 million of that going to local governments, and Florida Housing determining the targeting and within the federal law, helping people with allowable uses. So a couple of things I wanted to emphasize on this, and you can type in questions for later in this, but the key on the veto is the money is not swept to general revenue. The money just is going to remain in the trust fund. It's not like the legislature in the budget swept the money. It's just a veto. So as doc stamps come in, what's going to happen is that money is just going to be piling up in the local government housing trust fund, and it'll be available for appropriations or sweep or whatever, but it will stay in the trust fund until the legislature meets. And if that is in November in a special session, we'll be working really hard to try to get that money, or as much of it as possible, appropriated back to the SHIP program. So I wanted to just give that lead in, but then turn it over to Ken Pruitt, who will walk through what we accomplished this legislative session.
Well, Mark, thank you so much, and hello everyone. I'm Ken Pruitt, president of the P5 group. As Mark said, we head up the lobbying effort, working along with Sarah Bascom on the PR front. And to dovetail, Lisa, if you go to the next slide, we want to thank you very much for giving us the resources for the education component here. You know, it wasn't too long ago that we had 5 years straight where there was no funding for Sadowski, and thanks to the education efforts and the resources that you have provided, I'm proud to announce that although we did have the veto, but we'll live to fight another day in November whenever they come back for special session for those dollars, plus the governor's put 250 million, as Mark said, in CARES money. So we really have a golden opportunity here, not only for the 250 million now, but also in November when the legislature comes back for organizational session, and then a subsequent special session, those dollars will still be in play. And that's all thanks to you. So congratulations to you. Lisa, if you go to the next slide, thank you. We had 100% funding. As you can see, the governor, for 2 years in a row now, the governor has fully funded Sadowski. After 8 years of no funding, this governor has seen fit to fund for 2 years in a row in his term. We're grateful to him. We're so thankful to the Florida Senate, to President Galvano, to Appropriations Chair Rob Bradley, who were stalwarts in this, in providing full funding. During the session, our friends in the House, although they did put some money in, they did sweep $200 million, but to the good work of the other legislators, at the end of the day, for the first time in a long time, we had 100% full funding. So thanks to your efforts, obviously to the Senate efforts, to obviously the governor's efforts, and we're grateful to the Florida House as well for going along in conference and accepting that position. Lisa, next slide, please. What the real good news is that we had been looking for champions in the legislature with term limits. It's really difficult for us to get because of the lack of institutional knowledge. Sometimes it's difficult for us to find these champions because of the short term limits that they have. But we've been very grateful for the support of Senator Debbie Mayfield and Representative Sam Killebrew. These are two Republican legislators who stood tall. That's not to say that our Democrat friends, they've stood tall with us, but to be able to have two legislators who are in the majority ranks to stand with us as they did really helped us a lot. This bill, Senate Bill 306 and House Bill 381, although the bill didn't pass, the results of their effort were meaningful because we did receive 100% funding. And these, the Florida Housing Coalition is going to be showcasing these two legislators at their virtual conference by making them their champions of housing. So for those of you who are in Senator Mayfield's area, in the Melbourne area, and Representative Killebrew's area in Polk County. If you can just give them a call and say thank you for their efforts, that would be awesome. Lisa, next slide, please. But this is our original sponsor of Stop the Sweeps legislation. And what is so important about this senator is Senator Pasadoma from the Naples area. She was our majority leader this year. As majority leader, she didn't sponsor any bills, but her support, her enthusiasm by passing it on to Senator Mayfield was evident. And not only that, this was our first champion. And what is so great about Senator Pasadoma, she's going to be the Senate president in 2022 to 2024. And how awesome for us. So I know sometimes as you provide these resources, you're looking, well, where are the results? Where's the beef? Well, what we're seeing is that effort in the long term is that we're getting these champions from the very get-go whenever they start their term. And now here we have a future Senate president who is the original sponsor of Stop the Sweep. So we're really excited about her future and obviously and what it means to stopping the sweeps and making sure that we get full funding. Lisa, if I could please, next slide. Thank you. Just to give you a real quick update, there were 3,518 bills filed. Of those, 210 bills passed the legislative session. And Lisa, next slide, please. And one of those was a housing bill. Just quickly to go over this authorizes local governments to be able to put affordable housing development and residential, commercial, or industrial uses. Again, it authorizes them to go ahead and do that, whereas they didn't have that ability to do that before. And it also, as important, establishes the workshop for those commissioners, city council members, city commissioners who are on any type of affordable housing advisory board or committee. The Florida Housing Coalition is going to be providing thoughtful insight, help for them for the best practices that go on not only in Florida for housing, but all over the country as well. And what's innovative and what's working in other states and what's working throughout Florida, and to bring this energy of these elected officials together to be able to help them do a more efficient and effective job at a local level. So this was signed into law by the governor on June 9th. And so it was a banner session. And we have you to thank for that, for providing the resources. Thrilled as always to work with Sarah Bascom and her awesome team as they provided this synergy that we have on the lobby front plus the PR front has really worked well. And we are excited about the future and appreciate the opportunity to work with you all.
Thank you, Senator. And again, a reminder, there's over on the right-hand side, if you have questions, you can type them in and I'll attempt to direct them to panelists as we go throughout, or if we don't have time, answer them afterwards. And just one quick question for Senator Pruitt. I know you're still here, even though you're off screen. Our strategy has been to play a long game, and the long game is to try to get it where the default attitude in the legislature and the governor's office is full funded. How do you think we stand in getting that as the mindset compared to 6 or 7 years ago?
Well, Mark, it is night and day. There was a point in time, as you remember, and those who were on the call on the webinar, for 5 years straight, the legislature didn't fund it at all. And there's a thought process in the legislature: when you haven't funded something for 5 years, then it must not be worthy of any type of funding. We had to start all over again. And thanks to the great work of Sarah Bascom and her team, and also, like you said, the long ball of making sure that these future leaders like Senator Pasadoma will be a future president. Wilt Simpson, who's going to be the Senate president in November, working early on with him. He's been a great housing champion for us as well, and working with Speaker Designate Sprouse too. And so we've had some real stalwarts like Senator Bradley, President Galvano. I mean, look, when you have over $300 million, there's a huge target for that. And these legislators, that money, they wanted to use that money in a lot of other ways. And Senator Galvano, Senator Bradley, President Galvano, Senator Bradley, along with the governor, said, "Hey, look, we need 100% funding." So it's long ball is the key, and as we do it, we're developing these champions as they come into the legislature as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really important, as you know, a lot of the people on this call with the local HFAs are the people that fund our effort. And you know, we're not just saying this, but if you know, we're in a situation where we got an appropriation of $370 million, and when the governor vetoed, you know, he felt that he wanted to still keep housing whole. Now we know that the CARES money isn't the same as SHIP, and you know, that's not it. But he still put $250 million of CARES into housing when he vetoed SHIP, and he vetoed so that the money was really just sort of escrowed to see if it's going to be needed as general revenue later in the year. Those are really positives. And as we say a lot of times on the Sadowski Education Effort webinars, most states think they're lucky if they get 10 or 20 million for housing. And we're, you know, into, is it going to be, you know, 150 or 370 million, you know, that, or 200 million. So I think that's great. I want to turn it over to Sarah Bascom. Sarah has been leading our educational and PR part of our stuff for 10 years. And Sarah, take it away. Sarah, you're not on.
There we go. Can you all hear me now?
You're good.
Great. Good afternoon. As Mark was saying, we just finished our 11th session with you all, so going into our 12th. So we appreciate you trusting us to be a part of your team. My colleague, Kelsey Swithers, one of our vice presidents of our firm, has been leading this as well. But since we're all doing social distancing, you only get to see one of us on the phone this afternoon. So as Mark had mentioned, and President Pruitt, who's been a wonderful team member and a mentor of mine for over a decade, mentioned, we've been working with you all doing the strategic communications. Our firm is a legislative communications and a crisis management firm. We specialize, if you can go to the next slide, Lisa. And one more. We, again, strategic messaging. We focus on issue advocacy, which is a bulk of what we do for you all. Crisis communications, earned paid media, social, digital, and then full process video production. Next slide, please, Lisa. We represent associations, corporations, coalitions, issue advocacy campaigns, whether they are freestanding or, in your instance, focusing on legislative. And then we also represent elected leaders and then do campaigns, candidate referendums. More importantly, what we do for you, as I'd mentioned, we've been leading communications for you all since 2010. We do specific legislative initiatives if there are legislative bills, which as Senator Pruitt mentioned, and then when we first started working with Jamie and Mark many, many years ago, it was removing the trust fund cap, specific legislation to be passed, and then also working on offense and defense. Our main goal has always been, one of our main goals is appropriations for you all. So giving the support to the lobby team, to the members of the coalition that have been going out and advocating for, obviously, using housing money for housing. So what we do in that instance, we oversee and advise on all the communications for you all, whether it be earned media, paid media, and then just recently we've all started moving in with you guys into digital media, which I think has been a great change. Lisa, if you wouldn't mind, go to the next one. So specifically, one of the things at the very beginning that keeps us the most busy and keeps Jamie and Mark quite busy is focusing on editorial boards. So at the beginning of each session, typically a few months out, Kelsey on our team reaches out to all of the editorial boards, asks if they would like to speak with Jamie or Mark. We walk them through the new numbers, the new ask, and the continued question of how important it is. One thing I will tell you, out of all of the clients we have, the most well-received for editorial boards has been the housing client. President Pruitt often gives us accolades during session of how many editorials weigh in for all of you, and then also print editorials written by Jamie or by the group. And as much as I would love to say that is our expertise and something that we do on our own, it really is the subject matter and the audience that you all bring and that they want their readers to read. So out of every client we've had, this one is the most, I don't want to say the easiest because it sounds as if they just take it, but they are a consumer of this information. The editorial board want to push out your message. And that is something that is very hard to come by in mass like you see here. You could go to the next slide, please. So these are just some examples of some of the headlines. And as you can see, they've been spanning over the last 10 years, but most recently, and these are ones that they pick up and they push it, and it's just been greatly and well received. Next one, each year before session, we do press conferences, and Jamie is very big on planning for those quite early, and so is Mark. They make sure they've got elected officials, coalition members, make sure you've got regular people that this impacts. We've done it in various locations, from the Capitol to over at the realtors. So it just depends on the location, the timing. A lot of planning goes into this to make sure that we have the right timing, make sure there's not other noise that goes on. So to say that the press conference date each year is a moving target would be an understatement. We typically have to say, okay, we're going to do it with this member on this day. And then if something else pops up, the whole team quickly moves to move it to another date. So those are just examples of the press conferences. Another thing I've mentioned earlier, the next slide, please, is press releases and statements. So this falls under the earned media category. So often there are statements, whether it be to book into committee meeting, to get prepared for a committee meeting, after a key vote, prior to a key vote, or when the legislature comes down, when the budget passes, when vetoes come out. There is a lot of written work and statements that goes into it, making sure the lobby team signs off on it, making sure that every word is well received. And then usually these messages also come off of some of the advocacy alerts that you all get to call the governor's office and call members. All of this messaging ties in together. Packets and vote alerts. I know Mark and Jamie's team spend a lot of time putting these numbers together. And then our team with Kelsey helps with pulling the information from the coalition, packaging it. We used to do a lot of hand deliveries. Now, as you'll see in a little bit later, we focus on some digital distribution, which has been very well received and is very important right now when you're chasing lawmakers and you're trying to get into their phones and get in front of their screen and their news feed. But there is quite a few packets and vote alerts that have been happening over the years. Something new, if you could, next screen, that we added this year, which was something different. There's a lot of inside the Beltway blogs and news aggregators and websites that go to lawmakers and staff's phones every morning and then throughout the day. We were able to secure some space in Sunburn this year, as you can see right here. And this is a very high rate where a lot of lawmakers, they read them every morning. They take a look at the ads, then the ads go down. Sometimes the ads have movement. It just depends upon where you're placed. So that is something new that the coalition did this year. And as Senator Pruitt mentioned, using resources wisely, we've gone through a lot of different ways to attract and to get lawmakers' attention. So you have to educate them, then you have to advocate, and then you have to ask them to be with you. So it takes a lot of steps, and it takes a lot of different ways to get in front of them when there's so much noise, and that is especially important when it comes to the budget. So they go into lockdown, or they're with you until someone else needs the money for something else. So it's important to get into their phones and get into their newsfeed as much as possible. Next one is social media. As you can see here, anytime an editorial or an op-ed is printed, it is pushed out in different channels. We also often have the key bloggers and key influencers in and around the Capitol. We ask them to put some of our key tweets into their feed so that it pushes it out even further. You can see there's Safety and Florida Poll. There are different ways to tag these so that they get directly in front of lawmakers and key staff. The last slide, if you will, is looking ahead, looking forward. So one thing that we're always doing, and the team has already started with the group on the phone and with Mark and President Pruitt's team. Here we are now, as Mark said, the fiscal year starts July 1. What are we doing for next year? What are we doing to make sure that our message continues, but also that our message is fresh and unique, and it's not the same thing every time or delivered the same way? So you have to adapt to the changing advocacy environment, use unique communications activities. One thing we've talked about is with unemployment being at a high, affordable housing must go right in there with it. When you've got a crisis of economic proportion, let's not make it worse by not focusing on affordable housing. So we will spend the next few months with the team working on new ways to freshen the message and new ways to deliver that product as well. And we thank you all for having us continue to be on this team and this very worthy issue.
Thank you, Sarah. Much appreciated. I think one thing that has really been a success in terms of the marketing over time is we have sort of reclaimed a branding of just the word Sadowski. That when, there was a point 10 years ago where, there was people, most legislators hadn't been around, they didn't know what you were really talking about. I think at this point, when you say Sadowski funds, would you say that, virtually every legislator knows what you're talking about at this point?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I would say that word is probably used even more than affordable housing or housing when they're talking inside the bubble to each other. So yes, yeah. That word is as common as general revenue or recurring FEFP. It has become a staple with a meaning of affordable housing. I believe that's true.
That's great. Again, I would remind everyone that we encourage you to ask questions. That would be great because I don't want to have to ask all of them at the end. So if you could do that, and thanks, Sarah, hang in there. I'm going to turn it over next to Jonathan Payne, the Executive Director of NALHFA. We've kind of hit the state here where we had a great year and then a COVID impacted year, and there's been a tremendous amount of things happen federally. So Jonathan, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody for allowing me this opportunity to present and update everybody on some of the things going on the last several months here in Washington, D.C. If we can just go ahead and jump to a couple slides ahead, one more. So I thought I would give everybody an overview of what has happened up to this point in Congress, then discuss a little bit of some current legislation, and then next steps and prospects moving forward in the Senate. And then I'm going to touch on provide a little election preview, if you will, coming up in 2020, and what impact that might have on our priorities, housing priorities as an industry. So as you can see, on March 6th, Congress passed the first phase 1 bill, if you will, to provide immediate relief for workers and patients. It was a $8.3 billion package, and it focused on vaccines, testing kits, laboratory equipment, and international funding. Not too long after that initial legislation, Congress passed on March 14th, bipartisan COVID-19 emergency supplemental appropriations bill totaling another $3.5 billion. And some of those key provisions include requirements and resources for small businesses, including temporary federal coverage of sick and family leave and tax credits to reimburse employers, funding for emergency unemployment insurance provisions. That's that I think many people know, that added $600 that folks are getting from the federal government in addition to the state unemployment for each. And that has been a hot topic in Congress, what to do with that expiring unemployment insurance from the federal side. And Senate Republicans are against renewing that $600 unemployment insurance from the federal government. And there's some debate on how that will move forward. That unemployment actually expires the end of July. So I know a lot of us know folks are unemployed and been impacted and are relying on that $600 in addition to what they're getting at the state level from the federal government. And that's going to expire at the end of July. And so we're concerned about that in terms of what does that do to people's ability to pay their rent? Do they choose to not pay their rent or sacrifice food for their family? There's a lot of debate on what to do with the unemployment insurance. And then insurance plans would fully cover COVID-19 testing. That was a part of that supplemental appropriations bill. Next slide. So on March 27th, 2020, Congress passed a $2.2 trillion stimulus package known as the CARES Act and Phase 3 to provide important relief to Americans during the unprecedented crisis. This also includes the stimulus checks that a lot of folks got across the country. So you'll see that it focused on the small business paycheck protection programs, the economic industry disaster loans, Main Street lending program, the employee retention credit, and also included something called the qualified improvement property fix. So as you can see, all these first three phases, if you will, Congress threw a ton of money at around economic stability, if you will, and relief. It didn't necessarily focus a whole lot on our housing priorities. Some additional pieces of legislation that is not included in late April. Many of you might be aware, again, the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Industry Disaster Loan Program ran out of money. So those are those Small Business Administration loan program for many employee-owned companies who could apply for federal assistance to get them through these difficult times. That money disappeared really fast. So Congress had to spend another $470 billion to replenish those funding programs. And then in April, and then in June 5th, there was a lot of problems going on with the loan program. And in June 5th, they passed what was called the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, which made a lot of fixes, if you will, to the loan program. So those are what Congress was focused on in the early months of the COVID pandemic. Next slide. So now, what's going on now? I'm sure everyone is, if you're watching the news, you see a lot of things coming out of the House, the United States House of Representatives. So currently, on May 12th, Democrats in the House passed their preferred Phase 4, if you will, relief bill, which is called the HEROES Act. The legislation provides another $3 trillion in COVID-19 relief funding for individuals, businesses, and state and local governments. The HEROES Act was definitely crafted on partisan lines. It was declared dead on arrival by the Senate Republicans as well as President Trump as soon as it was passed by the House. Some of the things that the HEROES Act included were $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, which is a priority of NALFA, a priority issue of NALFA. $11.5 billion in emergency solution grants to help people experiencing homelessness, $75 billion in aid for homeowners, and $100 million in housing counselors, for housing counselors. So this was the first real sign out of Congress with a focus on housing. As you can see, again, as I mentioned before, the immediate focus was around economic stability and business relief. Next slide. So recently, on June 22nd, the House unveiled a comprehensive infrastructure bill that contains a lot of our housing provisions and priorities as an industry, and it's called the Moving Forward Act, HR 2. This bill is actually supposed to be voted on this week. We're expecting a vote in the House by Thursday before the holiday break. So some of the things that this includes, it does include the low-income housing tax credit. It also includes, allocates $5 billion for the home program. We're actually asking for $14 billion in the home program. So we think $5 billion is great. It's really, but in our opinion, we think it's a short-term solution. If you're looking forward to the long-term solution and in the long-term impact that we're all going to be facing, we believe $14 billion is the right number for the home program. It creates a new tax credit. It allocates $10 billion to the Community Development Block Grant, allocates another $70 billion for a Public Housing Capital Fund. Those are just to name a few things. But so what you might be asking, this is great. It has a lot of our housing priorities. And this will help us. But however, again, just like other legislation, this is deemed dead on arrival by Senate Republicans. And this is an absolutely massive bill. It's actually 2,309 pages if anyone's interested in taking a stab at reading it. There's quite a bit in this legislation. Next slide. So just recently, on June 25th, Senators Wyden and Cantwell introduced a housing credit bill called the Emergency Affordable Housing Act. So this is really focused on the low-income housing tax credit and permanently increases the housing credit authority from 2.81 per capita to 4.56. It establishes a new 30% basis boost. It temporarily extends the 10% test. So you might ask why the House has this included in the HR 2. Now Senate Republicans are introducing the standalone version. What are the chances of it going through? So first, the standalone version, and Senator Cantwell has been a huge supporter of this. She has been trying to get this passed in a variety of different means over the last few years, actually. And she is a tremendous supporter in the Senate for the industry. So what this standalone bill does and allows Senator Cantwell and Wyden is the flexibility to have some negotiation. And what I mean by that, the Senate Republicans are expected to introduce and announce their own legislation in the second half of July. So we're expecting a proposal from Senate Republicans by the end of July. What this this standalone bill does for folks such as Senators Wyden and Cantwell is to hopefully use this as a negotiating tool to get this included in whatever Senate Republicans introduce again later this month. So we're hopeful that it's a good sign that, again, the House passed its version that included a lot of the low-income housing tax credit priorities. Now the Senate has this bill, and we're hopeful that this can be reconciled at the end of the day, and we'll see some movement on this topic. Again, this has been a hot issue for the industry for a few years now, trying to get this passed. Next slide. So ALHFA has sent a phase 4 letter to the White House and Congress. And here's just a very brief, it's actually a few pages long, and it focuses on support for COVID-19 impacted vulnerable populations, and it includes that emergency rental assistance that I mentioned earlier for $100 million in increased funding for federal housing programs. It supports homeowners through mortgage assistance and forbearance forbearance issue, again, another very big hot topic, especially when the unemployment insurance runs out from the federal perspective at the end of July. If that's not renewed in some form, what does that do to folks come August 1 when their rent is due? Are we going to see an increase in folks not being able to pay their mortgages or their rent? So support landlords and Senate through a federal emergency stabilization fund, support the housing finance market through financing tools. A lot of this includes things like housing choice vouchers. Again, I mentioned earlier, we're advocating for $14 billion in home funding. We're advocating for a national housing assistance fund, which we're advocating for, again, emergency building stabilization funds. So there's a lot in this letter, and it also includes, again, the low-income housing tax credit program. You can bring up the next, I think there's an image actually on this slide if you want to bring it up. So in the coming days, NALFA will be sending out a communication that highlights our proposals and our vision for what we would like to see included in any phase 4 legislation at the end of the day. So next slide. So how can you help? So we will be sending out what we call an action alert. I'm sure you're familiar with those at the state level from Mark and Sarah as well. So we're going to be sending out an action alert regarding our phase 4 priorities, as well as the Wyden-Cantwell bill in the Senate. I was on a call yesterday with Senator Elizabeth Warren, and one of the things that we were talking about and strategizing about was, all right, how can we move things forward in a Senate controlled by Republicans? How can we? And she stressed, and I'll stress that, especially in Florida, where you have 2 Senate Republicans, it is absolutely critical to get Republican support for our housing priorities to get any of these pieces of legislation passed. The window is fairly small from now until the end of the year in terms of number of days that Congress is actually going to be in session. As everybody knows, it's an election year, so there's going to be a lot of, we have the August recess where there will be a lot of district campaigning going on at the district and state level. So how can you help? Be on the lookout for our action alerts. It takes literally 3 minutes, if that. All you do is plug your name in, type in your zip code. Everything else is created for you, and you just hit send. And that we try and make it as easy as possible for you all to contact your members of Congress. Next slide. So next, I want to pivot a little bit to the House and the Senate and the presidential election outlook, and just give a quick summary. I know we're running a little bit past time, so I'll be brief. So what the current House election makeup is: 435 House seats are up. They're all up in November. So the current makeup is 233 Democrats, 197 Republicans. 19 of those right now are considered toss-ups. So we do expect, and if you follow the polls and the experts, if you will, the political pundits, the Democrats fully expect to retain control of the House come November. But a lot can change from now until then. Really, you're going to start seeing, if you're not seeing it already, a lot of campaigning going on from now until election time. So a few races to keep an eye on, specifically for Florida, is, again, Ross Spano probably is the biggest target for the Democrats to take in Florida. Right now, according to Cook Political Report, that is leaning Republican. Another race that we're keeping an eye on is Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, a Democrat, Again, that one is leaning Democrat. And then Buchanan in R16. Again, that one is more likely to stay Republican, but these are three races that are being eyed as potential swings in the state of Florida. So I just thought I would highlight those. Next slide. I won't spend too much time. This is a chart that comes out of from Cook Political Report. It is updated constantly, and it tells you who is safe on the Democrat side, who might be a little bit on the fence in terms of leaning one side or the other, and then you'll see the toss-ups. Next slide. So quickly on the Senate side, the current makeup is 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. So this is where things get a little bit interesting for Democrats in order to take control of Congress. So right now there are 35 seats up in 2020, including special elections in Arizona and Georgia, of which 23 are held by Republicans, 12 by Democrats. So right off the bat, you can see Republicans have to defend almost twice as many seats as the Democrats. So that is in favor of the Democrats. Democrats are expected to lose the Senate seat in Alabama. If you remember watching the news, that was a very contentious race for an open seat. So they would need to win a minimum of about 4 to 5 seats to really achieve outright control of the Senate. However, it is very feasible that the Senate could end up in a 50-50 split. And if that's the case, the vice president is the tie-breaking vote. So that's where the presidential election becomes even more important for the Democrats and Republicans. So Senate races to watch. Senate races to watch would be Steve Daines in Montana, Joni Ernst in Iowa, Martha McSally in Arizona, Cory Gardner in Colorado, Susan Collins in Maine, and Tom Tillis in North Carolina. Daines, Ernst, McSally, Gardner, and Tillis are all first-term senators. And another note of interest is Mark Kelly, an Arizona Democrat. Many people might recognize his name, well-known astronaut, who is running to unseat Senator Martha McSally. That election actually would be up again in 2022, since this year's race is a special election to fill out the late John McCain's term in Arizona. So, and then in 2022, interesting enough, we're already taking a look at 2022. 34 seats are up in 2022, including Senator Rubio, who won election by just about 8% in the state of Florida. And again, similar to this year, Democrats have to defend 12, Republicans have to defend 22. So again, in 2022, that is promising for Democrats. Let's see, I'm going to speed it up. Next slide. I just want to be mindful of everybody's time. So jumping ahead to the election, I know, so Biden, Vice President Biden plans to announce his running mate by August 1st. He has been vetting quite a few, almost a dozen, if not a little bit more than a dozen, female potential candidates. He has made a promise that he's going to pick a female running mate. And the likes of Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Senator Klobuchar have all been vetted extensively already. I'll just point out an interesting that you all might know, Representative Val Demings of Florida is increasingly becoming a more and more of a interesting potential pick for the vice president. She is currently going through a extensive vetting process right now. And it might be interesting because Florida is going to be potentially the deciding state for who wins the election. Next slide. So this is an interesting graph. I won't dive in too much, but you can take a look at it, and it tells you just how close the last election was. I mean, you're talking about like Florida, for instance. Trump won by only 1.2%, 113,000 votes, which is nothing in the state of Florida. Trump's most vulnerable situation is if Biden can convince blue-collar voters to swing states to vote Democrat again. Florida and Pennsylvania are absolutely must-wins. If one side or the other wins those states, it's most likely a done deal for whoever wins those states. So I stress that. So anybody all of you in Florida, make sure you vote because you're going to play a big role in this election once again. Vice President Biden has more paths and combinations of states to achieve victory than Trump. There's 5 paths for Biden versus 3. In Florida has 29 electoral votes. Again, is positioned again to be a key battleground state. Next slide. And I'm going to finish up real quick, and then just a quick plug. We are having our virtual conference July 29th and 30th. If you are interested, just go to our website for more information and to register. And then next slide, just want to ask everybody to save the dates for next year. We are actually going to be in Florida, in Tampa, May 12th to the 15th. So please save those dates for our annual conference. And then next slide. I do want to introduce Kevin McKinney just joined our team. He is our new Director of Government Affairs. I've known Kevin a long time. I've worked with him for over 5 years. He is our new policy expert. So if you have any questions and I'm not available, please direct them to Kevin or myself. So I will stop there. Sorry, I was trying to run through as quickly as I could. Sorry about that, Mark.
No problem. Hey, thanks, Jonathan. And I see that we have incredibly, people don't want to type questions here today. So I'm looking at my tiny little screen here to see if I can pull up anything, and the answer is no, but I've got a few things then to add. First thing, again, reminder, all of these slides will be posted to the website. There will be a PDF of this PPT that'll be on the website. In fact, it's already posted. And then later this afternoon, this entire webinar will be posted. A couple of questions, and Senator Pruitt, if you want to chime in here, if you choose, but I'm going to talk this for a second. I got a lot of questions yesterday, kind of feedback, on our strategy that we took with the response to the governor's veto. And our collective wisdom was that given that the governor has committed to support full funding for his entire term and looks likely to continue, and that he put the money from the CARES Act in there, that there was really no reason, and certainly a bad strategy, to be critical or overly critical of the veto of SHIP, and that that he left the opportunity for us for a special session. And if you'd like to comment on that approach.
Well, Mark, it's a great point. Not only did he bring federal funding, although the SHIP funding it can't be used for a lot of the purposes that SHIP can be funded with or used for. The fact, number one, is that he put it in his original budget. Nobody, who could have thought that COVID-19 would hit us the way it did? He didn't take it all. He kept intact on the Sadowski front of it. He left the sale money, the workforce housing apartment money in the budget as well. So this governor has not only talked the talk, he's walked the walk as well. So he's been a stalwart. He could have taken that CARES money, the $250 million, and used it for something else. He didn't do that. He's putting it into housing. So we're very fortunate to have a governor who's in tune with the need of affordable housing in Florida.
Yep.
So and you also, look, he's done everything he said he would do. November is going to be here before you know it. Those dollars will then be able to have that discussion with Wilt Simpson, who will be Senate President, and Chris Sprowls, who will be the new Speaker of the House.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that we got yesterday, and someone said they raised their hand. Well, okay, you got to type your question. You raised your hand. Okay. Anyway, just I'll try to get over my sarcasm as I move forward. I got a lot of questions yesterday. What's Florida Housing doing with the $250 million of CARES money? A lot of that, about half of that's going to go to assist, their properties in terms of rental assistance for people that need it at the properties. About $120 million is going to local governments. Now, it'll be governed by the CARES Act restrictions. And I talked to Trey Price, the executive director of Florida Housing, this morning, and he said that he and his staff are working on the allocation formula for that $120 million, that they had originally thought that it would only go to jurisdictions that didn't get a certain type of CARES Act money themselves, but they're reconsidering that because of the SHIP veto. That's not decided, but it could go to basically to a narrower group, or maybe a group of local governments as big as the SHIP recipients, and that they're hoping to have their formula ready for review by the end of the week. And then next Tuesday is our Florida ALHFA conference session with Florida Housing, with Trey Price, the executive director, Marissa Button, the head of all their multifamily programs, and David Westcott, the head of all their single family, will be on there. Catherine Driver will be moderating for Florida ALHFA on that. So we urge you to tune in for the details of what Florida Housing is doing in general with tax credits, but specifically with the CARES Act money next Tuesday at noon. And as a technical reminder, I got some texts and emails during this where people, I think, thought that maybe that when they registered for last week, that they could keep using that same sign-in. That's not, we want to emphasize, every session you need to do a registration. We are constantly and repeatedly sending out to all of the sponsors and all of our HFAs the link to register for each specific session. And I'm going to send out again this afternoon the link for next Tuesday's session with Florida Housing. And if you want to attend that, it's important that you register for that session, and then you will get the proper dial-in information for that. Want to see last time if there's any questions. Don't see any. If you have any, just feel free to call or email me, and most of you have that contact information. I want to thank our panelists, Ken Pruitt, Sarah Bascom, Jonathan Payne, for the great overview of our legislative session, our strategy, and what's cooking in Washington. There's a lot going on, and we're going to stay on top of it. So I want to thank everybody for joining, and hopefully we will see all of you and a few more next Tuesday. Thank you.